It is once again my pleasure to welcome you all on the occasion of a public lecture on a very interesting and important subject, the Mughal engagement with the Sanskrit text, Dara, Shikoh and Yogavaasistha. For the lecture, we have Dr. Mohsin with us. He is a senior fellow at Center for Contemporary Studies, Prime Minister's Museum and Library, and a professor in the Persian department in Jamia Millia Islamia. And he is a well-known expert in Persian language and has also blazed the trail, as we say, as far as Turkish studies in India are concerned. So he has the rare distinction of having expertise not only in Persian, which of course we can find in many other people also in India, but in Turkish language, which traditionally has not been learnt by the Indian academia, but which is very important for understanding so many things and so many important texts, not only related to Indian history, but to the Ottoman Empire and other things, and for Central Asia. So I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Mohsin Ali, and I also welcome all those who have taken time out to be present here on this occasion. The subject is very interesting, I said, because we know that in India, just like all around the world, Islam in its heyday had a very well-developed tradition of engaging with different knowledge traditions, cultures, civilizations in various ways. Of course, the military expansion, warfare, etc. were also there, but side by side with that, there was an engagement with the local cultures, civilizations, and so on. And in fact, one can argue that the very rise of the Arabs at the time of of the arrival of Islam was very, in a substantial sense, it was influenced by the Greco-Roman world and of course by the Iranian culture and civilization. So even at its beginning, though it may not be admitted by many people, the reality is that Islam had absorbed, if not all, at least a critical part of the knowledge tradition of the ancient world, at least of that region, that is the Middle East and the Greco-Roman world. And of course, there is, of course, a tradition which says that India also, even at that beginning, taught a lot to the fledgling Muslim community and to Islam. As far as translations are concerned, they were a critical part, I would say, of the knowledge tradition of Islam and its political and cultural expansion for almost 800 years. We can say that from about the end of the 7th century up to the 14th or 15th century, it was the golden age of translation of texts written in other cultures, civilizations. So the first texts that were translated by first the Caliphate and then various Muslim empires in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in India, were the texts from Greek, and then of course several texts from languages like Aramaic, Hebrew, Persian, and then of course the turn of the Indian subcontinent came. So here in India, though the tradition of translation had started during the Sultanate period, but it took off in a real sense only during the Mughal period. So we see that during the Mughal period, there are not just one but sometimes multiple translations of some of the foundational Sanskritic texts like the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, and of course Panchatantra had been translated much earlier, but it was retranslated by the Mughals as well. And there was a proper translation department for doing all this work. We don't know the exact motives behind their undertaking of this very significant kind of translation work. Maybe it was the same as it had been in other parts of the world in the Islamic tradition, of taking from other cultures whatever could be taken, whatever could be absorbed within the rising and developing Islamic tradition. Maybe there were other reasons and motives. That is a question that I hope that Mohsin Ali ji will engage with. But the fact remains that as far as Yogavaasistha is concerned, Mughal engagement with Yogavaasistha is extraordinary, because there were 4 translations of Yogavaasistha, and these were not translations in the modern sense of the word. They were translations, editing, commentary, everything all in one, as it used to be the case. So 4 times Yogavaasistha was translated from 16th to 17th century, which means that from their perspective of the ruling class, the ruling Mughal class, there was something extraordinary from the philosophical, religious and spiritual point of view, which was found to be important and worthy of being translated again and again. Maybe because the earlier translations were not found to be satisfactory, or maybe there was also a legitimation process involved in translation, because by translating each king or prince was also invoking a different register of legitimacy, because in their perception Yogavaasistha was obviously, and for the Hindu society also, one of the most important texts of our tradition. So Dara Shikoh's engagement with Yogavaasistha is the focus of Professor Mohsin Ali's lecture. And as we all very know that Dara Shikoh, as he writes in his book Majma'ul Baharin, that is the confluence of rivers or streams, he himself was also in some sense a confluence of different things and streams. Of course, critics say that he dabbled into many things. Well, maybe he simply dabbled, but when you do many things, what can you do? You can only dabble perhaps. You cannot dive very deep. But the reality is that he did dive very deep as far as Yogavaasistha is concerned, as far as certain specific parts of the Sanskritic tradition are concerned. He did try to dive deep and arrive at a deep understanding of what was the inner meaning, the coded meaning, I would say, of texts like Yogavaasistha. So this is a fascinating story. I don't want to preempt the speaker. In fact, maybe I have already spoken for too long. So I would now like to request Professor Mohsin Ali to start with his lecture.
Thank you very much, sir, for this nice introduction. As you said, कि translation, अगर हम इसको कहें, translation is basically translation. It enriches, the other cultures also. We know about other cultures. So मेरे मुताबिक चूँकि मैं language का student हूँ, तो मैं इसे translation को translation कहना ज़्यादा पसंद करता हूँ. जहाँ तक Indian religious text, Indic text की बात है, तो उसकी शुरुआत before we come to Yogavaasistha, first of all, I will start with a Persian couplet, which is written by Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, and he's a great philosopher. He is saying, "Guft danaye baraye dastan ke dar darakhti hast dar Hindustan. Har kisi ke azmiwe u khurad wa burd नई शब्द अज ऊपीरनी हरगिज बेमुर्द। द ट्रांसलेशन मैं हिंदी में, चूँकि फ़ारसी का जो पोइट्री है उसको अगर हिंदी में करें तो वो ज़्यादा सटीक बैठता है, बिकॉज दोनों लैंग्वेज इंडो यूरोपियन फैमिली से बिलोंग करते हैं। तो इसका ट्रांसलेशन कुछ इस तरह से है। सामान्य अर्थ में मैं पहले कहता हूँ कि ईरानी फ़ारसी विद्वानों ने कथाओं में कहा है कि भारत में एक ऐसा वृक्ष है जो कि वेद वृक्ष है, जिसका फल उपनिषद है, और यदि कोई खा लेने का मतलब यहाँ उसका ज्ञान भोग कर ले, तो वो फिर कभी वृद्ध नहीं होगा और न कभी मृत्यु को प्राप्त होगा। सो दिस कपलेट इज सेड बाय रूमी फॉर इंडिया एंड फिर दिस वेद वृक्ष के बारे में। दार्शनिक अर्थ में कहें कि भारत में वेद को ज्ञान का वृक्ष माना गया है, तथा इसकी शाखाओं को ब्राह्मण ग्रंथ, इसके पत्तों आरण्यक ग्रंथ, तथा इसके पुष्प तथा फल को उपनिषद अध्यात्म ज्ञान कहा है। यदि कोई इस वेद वृक्ष का फल अर्थात उपनिषद को कोई खा ले, अर्थात इसके वास्तविक सत्य का ज्ञान का कोई भोग कर ले या जान जाए, तो वो जरा इस मरणशील रूप मूर्ति लोक से मुक्त और होकर आत्मज्ञान रूपी मोक्ष पद को प्राप्त कर लेता है। और जिसने आत्मज्ञान रूपी मोक्ष पद को प्राप्त कर लिया, वह फिर कभी इस जरा मरणशील संसार में पुनः उत्पन्न नहीं होता, अतः वह फिर कभी दोबारा वृद्ध नहीं होता और न ही कभी मरता है। शंकराचार्य भी कहते हैं, पुनरूपी जननन पुनरूपी मरणन पुनरूपी जननी जठरे शयनम यही संसारे बहु दुस्तारे कृपा करे पाही मुरारे। इसका अर्थ है बार बार जन्म, बार बार मृत्यु, बार बार माँ के गर्भ में शयन कराने वाले इस संसार से पार जा पाना अत्यंत कठिन काम है। अतः हे परमेश्वर, कृपा करके मेरी इस मरणशील संसार से रक्षा करें, अर्थात मुक्ति दें। सो दिस इज बेसिकली द रूमी ट्रांसलेशन। बिफोर आई कम टू द my topic, Mughal engagement with Sanskrit text and Dara Shikoh Yogavaasistha. My presentation is basically divided into 3 phases. First, I will give the introduction, and then I'll talk about Yogavaasistha. And then, as the sir has already introduced that the various versions of Yogavaasistha during the Mughal period, there are 3-4 translations which I will discuss one by one. And then I'll come to the Dara Shikoh translation, how it was different from the others 3. As sir has already said that the Panchtantra, during the Akbar time, Panchtantra has got more than 3 translations. Ayara Danish, Anware Suhaili, और उसके सबके रीजंस थे। रीजंस कुछ इस तरह के थे, कोई बहुत ज़्यादा अरबिसाइज्ड वर्ड था, बहुत डिफ़िकल्ट था आम पब्लिक को समझना, ठीक है। और कभी पर्शियन राइटिंग्स जो है पर्शियन पीपल के लिए उनको, जैसे अब अगर कहें कि राक्षस है, तो राक्षस को अगर शैतान से अगर ट्रांसलेट करें तो विच इज़ मोर मीनिंगफुल दैन द मराश से करें तो। सो इस तरह से ट्रांसलेशंस एक ही, मतलब ये जो 4-5 जो ट्रांसलेशंस हैं वो विद इन 50-60 ईयर्स हुए हैं। सो लेट मी कम टू माई टॉपिक बिफोर। One of the most researched figure in Mughal Indian history is Dara Shikoh, insofar as he was interested in both the old Hindu religious texts and the Muslim Sufi tradition. He has been depicted as essentially a scholar and the guiding light of the Mughal non-sectarian political culture. He was closely associated with some of the most prominent Qadiriya Sufi silsila like Mian Mir and Mullah Shah Badakhshi of his era, produced 2 Sufi biographical or hagiographical dictionaries, which is called Tazkira, composed 3 important treatises on complex mystical doctrines, studied religious scriptures and Indic philosophy, and by taking on the task of translating several Hindu texts from the original Sanskrit into Persian like Upanishad, Bhagavad Gita and Yogavaasistha. He started a discourse about the close ties between Islam and Hindu traditions. In addition to highlighting his limitations as a military and political leader, a number of contemporary historians have already commented on his politics, intellectual aspirations, and leadership abilities, explaining his downfall and the success of his brother Aurangzeb. Additionally, there are Mughal Indian successes that contrast his image to that Aurangzeb. In this presentation, there is a focus on something more specific than taking a stance on these different approaches. Especially, there is a discussion on a significant academic endeavor of Dara Shikoh, which is his translation of Yogavaasistha. In order to shed additional light on the prince's connection with this text for the research of the interaction between the Mughals and the Sufis, as well as on a larger Indic ethos of religious and philosophical dialogue, there following questions emerges in my mind. Why then did Prince Dara Shikoh request a new translation of the text after when the Nizami Panipati first translation was done by Nizami Panipati? He published a very accurate and faithful translation more than 50 years ago, and when Panipati had access of all these translation as well. What was the reason that why did he decided to write or commission a new translation, and what efforts he took, and was there something the prince missed from the Persian versions of the Yogavaasistha in 1655, a relatively late year in the princely life, and then he had not only cemented his image as a saint but also put his plans to take a Mughal throne into the action. So at the last stage, he is deciding to translate, because if you see Dara Shikoh before 1647 and after 1647, he is a different person. Before 1647, he is talking about Qadiriya Silsila, he is writing Sakinatul Awliya, Safinatul Awliya, Risala-e Haqnuma, studying all those Muslim theosophical literature and writing about that. But after 1647, he is meeting with Jews, he is meeting with Christians, he is meeting with Hindus like Baba Lal Das Bairagi, and he is getting transformed. And after that, he is coming, the second part of his life is basically translating the Indic texts like Bhagavad Gita, Yogavaasistha, or Upanishad, which is called Sirre Akbar, before writing, after writing this Majmu'ul Bahrain. So there was a transformation in Dara Shikoh's life after 1647. So in the light of these concerns, it is important to take a fresh look at the Mughal Yogavaasistha. To do this, we must first take a brief glance at the motivation for the selection of this work by Mughal scholars and their patrons, as well as how they attempted to convey their interpretations in Persian. After that, the analysis of the translation of Dara Shikoh translated and placed it within the broader framework of the Mughal political thought. So, should I give the Yogavaasistha introduction, sir, or? Okay. Yogavaasistha is basically a collection of philosophical narratives. The book of Vasistha and his Yog, that is called Yogavaasistha, is also known as Maharamayana, Ars Ramayana, or Vasistha Ramayana. These are the few names which is Yogavaasistha known by the Yogavaasistha is named. As the work makes clear, the word yoga in the title does not refer to ascetic practice, but rather a type of philosophical understanding known as jnana. The text, which consists more than 32,000 verses, is a long debate between the Prince Ram, venerated as Sri Ramchandra or Ramchand in Persian translation, and sage Vasistha Muni, translated as Basist in Persian version. Even in this brief period of time between its first appearance as the Yogavaasistha and its original introduction of Mokshopaya, that is, means of freedom, a literary book published in Kashmir in the 10th century, the book went through multiple incarnated versions. These included modifications to the framing stories that introduced it and shift into the philosophical lexicon. The changes equate to nesting this work within a framework more appropriate for Brahminical theological tradition and supporting common Vedantic terminology to replace a large portion of his unique vocabulary of the text. There exists almost 6,000 verses in Laghu Yogavaasistha, that is called concise Yogavaasistha, which emerged in between the comprehensive Brihad Yogavaasistha. This version was formerly known as Mokshopayasara, the essence of the means of freedom, a text that is thought to have been written by Abhinanda of Kashmir. However, it is unclear when it is written or by whom. However, some of the structural improvement made by the Laghu Yogavaasistha have had an impact on subsequent iteration of the Yogavaasistha. One such modification is the way the chapters are arranged in the two Mughal Persian translation of the text by Dara Shikoh and Nizami Panipati. The fundamental philosophical ideas of these texts were further skipped and misrepresented in a number of subsequent versions. The first significant similarity between these works is the placement of philosophical dialogue between Ramchandra and Vasistha Muni inside the larger context of Ramayana. The second is the implementation of philosophical narratives, many of which are exclusive to these writings, after which they were widely circulated and reflect the philosophical goals of the text in a distinctive way. It is important to note that this work was on the top of its role as a model for knowledge for rulers who found themselves split between the demands of the disenchantment and disengagement, that is Vairagya, from the values of the power and pleasure, on the one hand, and the requirement to appear as though they were promoting these values through their interactions with the outside world, and on the other. Notably, the book portrays the predicament of rulers split between opposing values as the product of reasoned deliberation, that is vichara, that is an accomplishment rather than a sign of pessimism or a simple emotional confusion. Therefore, the remedy of the problem must also be logical and must bring rulers back into the world via effective, graceful, and thoughtful action. So here we are going to discover that Dara Shikoh recognized this intriguing perspective of the Yogavaasistha, which may also account for his discontent with the previous translation. Prior to examining the reading and translation method that the prince promoted, it is necessary to provide some background information of the other Persian Yogavaasisthas which were prevalent both inside and outside the Mughal court. The Persian Yogavaasistha, before the translation of Yogavaasistha by Dara Shikoh, there were three expediently available Persian translation of the text. One was from the period of Akbar, written in 1597 under the patronage of his son Jahangir, and one by Nizami Panipati. The additional two versions date from Jahangir in itself. One is attributed to Sufi Qutub Jahani, well-known Sheikh Sufi Sarif, and the other is visiting Iranian philosopher Abul Qasim Findersky. Panipati translated Laghu Yogavaasistha of Abhinanda, which has 6,000 verses, literally, and Sheikh Sufi Qutub Jahani title was Atware Dar Hale Asrar, which was dedicated to Emperor Jahangir, appears to have been based on the Yogavaasistha Sara. So, the Yogavaasistha written by Abul Qasim Findersky is explicitly a selection which is called Muntakhab in Farsi rather than continuous translation of the Sanskrit text. So these were the three versions basically. The Yog was, now I will discuss one by one how the Nizami Pati translated with whose help and how he got the patronage, who was the king. And according to the Panipati, Prince Salim found himself drawn to learning because he valued knowledge and showed a desire to discover the truth. Consistent with the image of Prince Salim, the work maintains a focused approach. It is believed that he was informed about the Yogavaasistha during one of the evening gatherings mentioned above, given the Pandits that frequented his court and his penchant for stories. This is where his request of Persian translation of the work came from. The print shown by Panipati in the preface of the work alters the traditional perception of Jahangir, who is frequently portrayed as dipsomaniac and who, after ascending the throne, showed little interest in running the empire, which he delegated to his queen Noor Jahan. Thus, the text of the Panipati provides significant support for various texts on the emperor. It is well known that Jahangir developed an interest in Indic customs and tasawwuf. It is also known that Jahangir carried on the policy of Akbar, urging Muslims and Hindus to try to accepting the customs and faith of one another. He instructed the translation of Yogavaasistha from Sanskrit into Persian at the same period. The Yogavaasistha is a collection of outstanding valuable exhortation of advice derived from the authentic works of the Brahman intellectuals of India. Consequently, Nizami Panipati, who assumed himself down-to-earth scholar of the court, assumed responsibility for translating it. Without any addition of interpolation, Pathan Mishra Jaipuri and Jagannath Mishra Banarsi provided the substance and contents of the text. After that, these were translated into simple Persian. An extensive introduction titled Muqaddame Kitabe Yogavaasistha, which is Muqaddama is called preface, follows the preface of the translation, which appears to be Abhinanda's introduction to his Laghu Yogavaasistha. As the length of the Yogavaasistha was excessively long, Abhinanda produced a shorter version. He divided his reduction into 6 chapters, each of which was then divided into smaller sections. The framing a story which opens the first half of the first chapter features the conversation between Bhardwaj and Valmiki. Now I'll discuss the Yogavaasistha of the Sheikh Qutub Jahani, the second translation. Despite being presented in the court, Nizami Panipati translation seems to have garnered popularity outside of it as well. Hence, it is significant that Sheikh Qutub Jahani began creating a preferred version of the Yogavaasistha based on the Yogavaasistha Sara. Yogavaasistha Sara was basically again a collection of stories written in 14th century by Madhavacharya in Kashmir. So he is taking that text, not the text of Laghu Yogavaasistha by Abhinanda. So this is the another text which he is taking it, where the 25,000 verses are there. 2,500 verses are there. So Sheikh Qutb Jahani is translating that one basically. The introduction reads as follows. The treatise entitled Atwar Dar Hale Asrar aims to chronicle the accomplishment of Basist and Ramchand, who achieved the search of Gnosis and brought it from the behind the veil. It was translated into Persian and given a attire. It is possible to assume that this quality and layout of the text amounts to a significant portion of the philosophy found in Yogavaasistha, which Panipati had already translated into Persian. Nevertheless, the author conveys the idea that he translated the work rather than simply abstracting it from another translation. The division of the book into 10 chapters, although Nizami Panipati book was in 6 chapters, but Sufi was, Sheikh Qutb Jahani was in 10 chapters. This basically further refutes the idea that it is a selection drawn from the previous translation. We do not know if the translation was ordered by emperor, but Qutb Jahani dedicated this translation to Jahangir. Now, the another important writer, which is Findersky, which I am going to talk about, it's a very interesting translation he has done, because till now Qutb Jahani and Panipati was doing in prose form, although the Yogavaasistha is a poetry form. But the Findersky is a great scholar, he is doing in prose and poetry form. And what he is trying to do, he is trying to put Rumi couplets, Attar, Nishapuri, and many other Sadi, Hafiz, all those Iranian poets with this Yogavaasistha. So Findersky was in India during a period of time when there was an overall trend of comparative philosophical and Gnostic study, and research had been stimulated by Mughal policy of commissioning translation or retranslation of several significant Indian religious and secular texts, including the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Panchtantra. It was in this intellectual and social atmosphere that Findersky developed an interest in and started translating Yogavaasistha. Examining areas of commonality between the various traditions and sects was made possible in an effort to reduce the likelihood of conflict in the actual world. Muntakhab-e Yogavaasistha, selection from the Yogavaasistha by Abul Qasim Findersky, is a significant example of Yogavaasistha circulation in Mughal India. The text was translated from the original Sanskrit into the simple Persian, which he is writing in preface as Zabane Hindi Tarjume bi Farsi Sade. Thus, in this version, Findersky combined both prose and poetry. In the honor of the Yogavaasistha, he write 4 couplets, which I will translate. First I will read in Persian, then I will translate in English. That what is the importance of Yogavaasistha in front of him. He is saying, Hamchu aabast in sukhan bi jahan, pak wo danish fazaye chun Quran, chun je Quran gujashti o akhbar, neest kas rabedin nemat guftar, jahil ke u shanid sukhban, ya bidid in latafe Savaristan, Juz bi Surat bidin Nehamand, Jan ki Barish Ikish mi Khandan. The translation is like this: like water, this book, any Yogavaasistha, or this speech, is for the world, it is pure and impart wisdom just like Quran. After you have read the Quran and the Prophet traditions, there is no discourse like this from anyone else. The ignorant person who heard this speech or observed the beautiful sensitive, sacred and expressions observes only its outward manifestation and hence comes across as a foolish. In a way, the text of the Findersky is also a summary. In actually, unlike Qutb Jahani text, it is not structured into chapters. It reads more lengthy essay or possibly a commentary on the few distinctive Yogavaasistha philosophical topics. Findersky works has a key Sanskrit technical phrases in their original form with an elaboration, but Qutb Jahani text contains almost no Sanskrit words. Like Findersky is explaining what is ahankar, what is moksha, what is dhyan, jivatma, paramatma, kriya. He is explaining all these things in Persian, but Qutb Jahani text doesn't give any explanation. The text focuses on the several essential concepts that were repeatedly conveyed through the diverse metaphors and exhortations. For instance, it is imperative to acknowledge that Brahm is the fundamental source of all reality and that all other beings originate from it. Furthermore, Brahm, the foundation of everything which is one, will never die and in contrast, these forms are beings will be destroyed themselves. Secondly, one has to acknowledge that existence is just a worldly confinement, and that humanity's own beliefs is in independent existence is an illusion. To break free from the imprisonment, the objective should always to be focused the mind on the one form whom existence originates. These two themes makes clear that the text frequently considers the question of illusion and reality, judgment and perception. The Persian verses that are embedded through the text to illustrate the aforementioned themes are one of its most unique features. While Fani is the author of the majority of these verses, there are also a number of verses by Rumi, Hafiz, Sadi, Attar, and other authors. Given his prominence, it is possible that the Fani jo takhallus hai is basically he himself is writing as a Fani because he is composing all this poetry. So now I'll touch the Yogavaasistha is how is considered as a Sufi text in Persian. Nizami Panipati first translation during the Akbar reign was more precise and accurate, while the two translations from Jahangir period, which is Atwar Dar Hale Asrar by Sheikh Sufi Qutub Jahani and Muntaqib Yogavaasistha by Abul Qasim Findriski, are largely interpretive. Putting these variations aside, we see that the spiritual themes of the Yogavaasistha are more prominently highlighted in all Persian translations of the text. That is, the knowledge of being is stressed rather than the relationship between knowledge and action in the world, which is made possible by knowledge. The history of Findriski translation is, in reality, part of the evidence that the text was mostly interpreted as a Sufi starting with Jahangir's period. Findriski, basically, he was a traveler and a newcomer to India. He had learned Sanskrit, and when he was faced with the decision of the selecting for the text for his personal translation endeavor, he seems to have been so taken with Qutub-e-Jahani version of the text, since it bore clear filial ties to the philosophy of Ibn Arabi, that is Wahdatul Wujud, or you can say Vedantic Aham Brahmasmi, that he chooses Yogavaasistha to insist of the Upanishad and the Ramayana. He chose Yogavaasistha rather than Upanishad and Ramayana. He also refined and augmented Qutubuddin Jahani versions and skillfully incorporated Persian spiritual poetry into it, producing an elaborate and intensely personal explanation of his Sufi poetic interpretation of the Yogavaasistha that reflected his grasp of the Hindu religion. Findriski translation of the work, particularly in terms of the preparing it as a Sufi work, was an enhanced version of the Qutub Jahani works in certain respects, and his focuses particularly emphasis to illustrating how the idea in the original texts are consistent with the directly related to those in the Persian Sufi traditions. Additionally, it seems that the work of Qutub Jahani and the Findriski that during the 17th century, at least in some spheres, there was an extensive effort to address the apparent parallels between the various religious traditions, and this trend was also culminated in Majmu'ul Bahrain and Sirr Akbar of Dara Shikoh. Even at the level of the linguistic registers, the Yogavaasistha primarily spiritual concerns are evident in both interpretive versions. The chapters headings of the Qutub Jahani works are helpful in this regard. Like he is saying that in 6th chapter he is saying Tarjeed. Tarjeed, it gives the meaning of celibacy. Marifat-e nafs, knowledge of self. Marifat-e haq, knowledge of truth. Yaft-e nafs, that is experience of the self. Marifat-e hal-e khud, knowledge of one's own state or condition. And Kamal-e marifat-e haq, that is the perfect knowledge of truth. Beyond this emphasis, the text contains a numbers of terms that are also appropriate for the Sufi text, including Alam-e-Fani, that is transitory world, Jat-e-Haq, that is divine essence, and Arif, which you all know, the mystic, as well as the Suluk, trading part of the Sufi path, Murshid, spiritual guide, and Talib, seeker. Now I'll start with the Dara Shikoh translation of the Yogavaasistha. The translation of the Dara Shikoh is similar to the translation of the Panipati and adheres to Vedanta Lagu Yogavaasistha. Nevertheless, Dara Shikoh omits numerous verses, sought in others, and incorporates explanatory notes from other pertinent texts, such as certain medieval commentaries on Yogavaasistha. His translation works begin in 1655 or 56. It is particularly important to consider that by then he had created and established his own image of himself as an ideal Sufi. In fact, he seemed to portray himself as a practically a spiritual teacher in the self description contained in his other writings, going even beyond the rhetorical conventions of the Sufi literature. Thus, it is important that he diverges with the strictly Sufi interpretation of the Yogavaasistha. Historically, it is quite evident that at this point of time, Dara Shikoh had made his political aspiration for the Mughal throne and had started to use different legal procedures to get his way against the other contenders in the court. The significance of the prince's commitment to the Yogavaasistha can be best understood in the context of the dual self-image of a Sufi and his prevailing quest to assert his political rights to the throne. Dara Shikoh's scholarly engagement with the text, and not only as a throne claimant, has several aspects that merit dedicated assessments. These includes his creation of the textual basis for the translation and the interpretive modalities he employed in an attempt to understand the work. According to his own account, the prince was unsatisfied not only with the interpretation of the Yogavaasistha in existing translation, but even with the literary foundation that preceded earlier translations. Accordingly, before he even started translating, he established new standard for himself and directed a new source text to be produced. He included additional literature such as commentaries on Gita and on Yogavaasistha and even the Puranas into the original text itself. It appears that other scholars contributed to the preparation of the text that serve as the foundation for the translation, including many Pandits who dedicated the text to others who documented it. Therefore, the translations may not necessarily be Dara Shikoh's own accomplishment. It is important to note that although the prince is addressed in the third person in this context, that is, as the one who orders or requests that the translation is prepared under his auspices, he takes care of emphasis that the research conducted by the scholars working under his direction will be verified by him. In Farsi, he is saying, "Mi khwaham in kitab mustasab ba behtar az dar huzure ma tarjume kunid wa sukhnane in taif ramutabik ittigah bedehi." But what was the nature of his supervision? Does this mean that he made enough contribution to the able to proclaim himself to be the translation of the Yogavaasistha? This is a gray area because there is evidence of his own research and interpretation in addition to his stated authority for the preparation of this text. More broadly, Dara attempts without persistently identifying the original text as a cultural order to accept the teachings of the Yogavaasistha within the Persianate world. The reason Dara Shikoh effort to make the text coherent with literary Persian perspective through editing and workman-like methods are significant is that they allow readers to observe how he differed from the previous works of the Yogavaasistha. While focusing on the details of the essence of his translation, it is evident from the preface that Dara Shikoh aimed to provide clear and concise translation of the Sanskrit word in Persian for his novel translation. In order to prevent misinterpretation, he suggests that a term be translated or understood in Persian the first time it appears. However, if the term recurs throughout the text, he would like this interpretation to be repeated or even the original Sanskrit term used so that readers are familiar with it in both the languages. This is consistent with his other translation works also, such as Majmu'ul Bahrain, Sirr-e-Akbar and Bhagavad Gita, and to which he also added glossaries also. The vocabulary choices in the text are even more astonishing. For example, when Ram Chandra addresses Vishwamitra, he refers to him as a Ustad, master, and he is saying Dana ye buzurg. Dana ye buzurg ka matlab ye hota hai Farsi mein a wise elder. Then he is saying Buzurg Hamedan, all-knowing elder, rather than Rishi. A peculiar derivation found in the text of the Panipati. One more instance of his felicitous transformation appears in the episode where Vishwamitra directs King Dashrath that he gave Ram permission to go into the forest and vanquish the demons, whereas the Panipati properly interprets the source of this evil as a Makshas, which is called demons in Sanskrit or Rakshasa. Even explaining them as a disciple of Ravana, Panipati is mentioning that these Rakshasas are the disciple of Ravana, but Dara Shikoh uses the generic Persian name Shaitan, which is devils. It is obvious that Dara Shikoh used vocabulary and phrases that were more suited to the Persian listening. However, this does not imply that the text of Dara Shikoh is more Arabicized or Persianized, like Barakallah and Mashallah. This part I will skip. Dara Shikoh devotes even more attention to the Persian literary culture. For example, the manuscript of Dara Shikoh does not include the preface of Abhinanda from the Panipati's version and replaces it with the Bairag Prakaran, chapter of disenchantment, or Vairag Prakarana in Sanskrit. This omission undoubtedly demonstrates Dara Shikoh's access to the larger range of the Indic texts that his comparatively lesser reliance on the Abhinanda's recension. But in deleting this preface, some specifics of the Hindu Dharma included inside, such the definitions of the terms like avatar and yug are removed. It is as though Dara Shikoh considered these to be minor distraction from what he saw to be primary thrust of the work. Dara Shikoh careful avoidance of the ideas like soul transmigration, which seems to be accurately described in Panipati's version, lends credibility to this notion. Dara Shikoh seems to be judging these ideas overly carefully, which would only serve to further detach Persian Muslim readers from the text as a subsidiary to the primary idea. The important assertion made by Dara Shikoh that previous translators could not raise the veil from the bride of nuanced ideas that recites in the book. In Farsi, he is saying that Ach Chehra Arushan Iddaka wa Parda Dar Nadashtan may become clear in the light of these examples. Dara Shikoh purposefully and significantly simplified the text in attempt to reveal this bride. How far did Dara Shikoh achieve in comparison to the other writers? The reply to this question can be seen by comparing Panipati's text or with the Dara Shikoh text. As such, Panipati's translation, which closely adheres to the Abhinanda's original text, is far longer than Dara Shikoh's text. Despite the fact that Dara Shikoh included insightful interpolation from the other Indic writings, his text is considerably shorter. Setting aside this artificial analogy, there is also a need to inquire as to why and how the prince summed up the contents of the text. It is found that Dara Shikoh, in the context of Qutub Jahani and Findriski, selectively in a shortened form, reproduces the stories themselves, giving them significance. Dara Shikoh was therefore disconnected with the Findriski's and Qutub Jahani translation techniques, since it ignored the important philosophical lessons of the story in favor of the exclusive concentration on philosophy. Nevertheless, the writing of Dara Shikoh is clear and accurate. Instead of translating the stories verbatim, he stays away from the Sanskrit text ancillary aspects and instead presents them in a clear, concise and concentrated manner. He accomplishes this because when translating this text into Persian, he was concerned in maintaining the work's content, including the use of stories, while making it legible and approachable to the Persian readerships. Now, I tried to give another angle with this political thought, which I said that he is prince. The political orientations of Dara Shikoh text. I'm still working onto that, but somehow, why he chose Yogavaasistha, there is explanation. I'll narrate, read out. Dara Shikoh, in his role as an editor and translation of Yogavaasistha, has significantly contributed to the preservation of the Yogavaasistha within the Persianate literary culture, surpassing the achievements of his predecessors while remaining true to their objective. Additionally, it is essential to consider Dara Shikoh's political analysis of the text. Taking into account the political environment that influenced his interest in the Yogavaasistha, the prince is described in exaggerated terms, suggesting that he is a king, Shah, a highly accomplished holy figure, and the perfect manifestation, Mazhar-e-Atam, possessing high ethical virtues like Makarim-e-Akhlaq, which is said in Persian Makarim-e-Akhlaq. So, before all these things, there is a reconsideration of Dara Shikoh's dream, which he saw. It is necessary to revisit the start of Dara Shikoh Yogavaasistha before drawing any conclusion, and it should be noted that his translation of the text was directly inspired by a dream he had after reading Qutub Jahani's version. After reading the Qutub Jahani version of Yogavaasistha, he saw a dream, and he is saying this, Vikramjit Harsad has written, and many other scholars have also quoted this. After I read the translation of selection from the book Yogavaasistha by Sheikh Sufi Qutub Jahani, one night in my dream, I saw two persons, one elderly in appearance standing on a higher plinth and the other standing slightly lower. I realized that the person standing on the higher plinth was Guru Vasisth and the other was Ramchand. The difference in the appearance of these two respectable persons was the bassist's beard and mustaches had a few grey hairs, while the others had not even a single grey hair. Since I had benefited enormously from this wise book, I could not help out but approach bassist and paid my respects. Bassist showed me extraordinary kindness. He placed his hand on my back and said, "O Ramchand, O Rama, he is the true extraordinary seeker. Embrace him." Ramchand embraced me with a great love, and then bassist gave Ramchand sweetmeat, and he offered it to me to eat with his own hands. I ate that sweetmeat. After seeing this dream vision, the yearning to possess a new translation grew up. It is crucial to emphasize that this is the documented dream of a prince who not only discovered himself in the presence of Ram and Vasisth, but is acknowledged by them as one of their own, as a seeker of the truth. Dreams hold significance in both Sufi and Indic traditions. Dara Shikoh also asserts to have experienced extraordinary dreams in his own Sufi writings. However, the aspiration to be acknowledged and included in the lineage of the truth seeker, meeting the dual standard of the royal power and the spiritual excellence through the pursuit of the truth, and which warrants a special attention. This is especially significant due to the pivotal role of the dreaming, both as a means of conveyance and a subject of narratives, which has been emphasized in Yogavaasistha. Understanding this purpose of the framing the story or the text in is one way to start thinking about this remarkable dream. Here Dara Shikoh imagined himself in a frame that precedes the event of the book, rather than at the beginning of the work. When the dialogue between Valmiki and Bhardwaj occurs, especially he imagined himself participating in the discussions between Ram and Vasisth. As a result, Dara Shikoh has imagined himself living in the period not of the text, but of the event it describes and draws inspiration from them. Dara has gone to the very source of knowledge through his dream, even though it seems that he lives much beyond the time period that the text depicts. The message of the Yogavaasistha itself may lead to assume that there is a world in which numerous things are possible, so that Rama and the Valmiki are still present and embrace the talks that Valmiki relates to as having taken place in the past. Thus, Dara's dream is a kind of continuation of Yogavaasistha's forms and teachings. However, there is also an important similarity of Sufi traditions. Sufi are also known to seek permission from the person about whom the book is written, rather than from a book in order to write on a subject. In the translation of Dara Shikoh, this approval typically manifests in them from the authentic dream vision. This vision reveals the timeless relevance of the historical figure, even if they are only experienced by a select few, as exemplified by Dara Shikoh. It is also difficult to think of a more remarkable approach to present the Yogavaasistha as a passionate work and to bring the Islamic and Indian traditions closer together. Now, the conclusion part. The translation by Dara Shikoh marks a deliberate deviations from the earlier Mughal Yogavaasistha, and as it was a creative attempt to incorporate the Indic work into the Muslim imaginations that spoke not just mystical issues but also ideal kingship. Rama is portrayed in the Yogavaasistha as a spiritual leader and a perfect ruler, a portrayal that clearly resonated with Dara Shikoh's own goals and aspirations. Thus, by establishing his future monarchy on the image of ideal Ram, the text also indicates a significant step taken by Dara Shikoh in preparation of his own accession to the throne. Dara Shikoh discovered a model for the Indian saint king in the Yogavaasistha, following which he would have most likely constructed a moral framework for his own rule. In accordance with the teachings of Yogavaasistha on time and narrative, the prince discovered himself in a counterfactual lineage in his dream, whereby he is Ram's younger brother, who is his elder and contemporaneous. Thus, Dara Shikoh is more than just a Sufi scholar or a prince of the Mughal dynasty, as evidenced by his dream. He is also a political theorist in the ageless company of Ram, the perfect ruler and the truth seeker, a work of literature describing the various alternate worlds that coexist with our own is called the Yogavaasistha. Perhaps no one else saw the reality of the political dream that could exist based on Yogavaasistha more than Dara Shikoh. According to this dream, a Persian prince could identify himself as a heir to Ramchandji and have access to the ideal political structures, moral standards, and systems and rules of the governance that were associated with Ram. It remains to be seen if this was merely a figment of imagination, similar to Dara's dream, which marked the commencement of his version of Yogavaasistha, a dream influenced by political optimism drawn from the Yogavaasistha's exploration of the potential realities that one is obligated to bring into the existence through the storytelling. That's all.
Thank you very much, Mohsin ji. We are all delighted, and we all have learned a lot in the process.